This is the first in a series of 4 short narrated PowerPoints on the concepts of sampling, reliability, validity, and statistical power. These were all concepts that were covered to some degree in your assigned readings from Kim and Mallory, but I want to flesh out these and give you what I think of as a more basic, plain language description of what I think are some important aspects that were missing from your reading. I believe that understanding these concepts in a basic way will help you understand study designs and the methods that we use in a study, and that will help you in your future readings for this course. It will help you read the literature and have a different understanding of it, and importantly, it will help you think differently about your capstone, having these understanding these foundational concepts. So let's start with the first one as content on sampling. So I'd like to start with a few definitions. Kim and Mallory talked about this difference between a population and a sample. So when we do a study, we're often interested in doing that study for a certain population. And so, for example, people who are at risk for type 2 diabetes would be a population that we might be interested in. Now, obviously, that's a very large population if we would look at all those people across the United States or even within a state. And so researchers will select a sample that's feasible for a study, and that sample is this subset. But what we want is a representative sample. So we're getting at this second term here. And that's a sample whose characteristics are comparable to those of the population. This will make more sense when we get a little further. So right now we're keeping kind of at a surface understanding. And one of the things we need to be careful of is the methods we use in sampling can influence how representative that sample is. And so if we're not careful with how with our sampling methods, we can introduce more what they call sampling bias. And these are these distortions that can happen when a sample is not representative of that population. So let's define the terms that are here. These definitions come from this textbook, Nursing Research, which is a highly regarded textbook on nursing research and methods. So we've already talked about the meaning of a population. They include a term called the target population. And so what they're emphasizing by this is that often a population, that entire aggregate of cases, is simply too large to even think about generalizing a study to a population that large, because there's so many ways that population can differ from each other. And so they use this term of target population to define that group of cases that you want to be able to generalize your results to. You want to say, my results pertain to these participants down here, these participants in my study. I can say that these apply to this target population. So the next step down is to think about who in that target population that you can access. Now that's a pretty interesting question. So let's say your target population are patients having a certain condition in the hospital or clinic where you work. Chances are if you get permission to your study, that's a pretty accessible population to you. Accessible due to having contact information, addresses, but other populations, and a good example in your textbook would be homeless people in, let's say, even in a city that's as small as Madison. Imagine the difficulty of counting who's even there in that target population to say who you have access to. The sampling frame is a list of all of your cases in the accessible population. And we typically add numbers to that list. And the sampling frame then, that list, that numbered list, is used to randomly select cases. So your textbook talked about random sampling. And what's important about random sampling is that everybody in that sampling frame, everybody in that accessible population, has an equal chance of being in the study. It's thought of as a gold standard, as a method to obtain a representative sample that has less bias, because, once again, everybody in that list has an equal chance of being in the sample. And then that next term, under sampling frame, is your sample. Those that you've selected to invite to be in the study or to be in the study. Now for some types of studies, for example, a survey study, you send an invitation to people to participate in a study. In other types of study, let's say you're using electronic records and you already have permission to have access to the records, you would use a sampling method to decide which of those cases. You might include all those cases, but sometimes you use a sampling method to select those who would be in the study. And this process of sampling is used to select that sample, but then it's those participants are those members of the sample who are actually in your study. And it's the participants that you have data for that you will analyze then to reach your conclusions. So the goal, when we're finished with sampling, is to have participants who are representative of the target population. We want the characteristics of our participants to be similar to the characteristics of a target population. So first of all, how do we assess that? How can we assess the degree to which our participants are representative? Well, one good idea is to look for what we think of as data, demographic data on these characteristics. Typical characteristics that we collect in a survey or that we might try to get from a medical record are things such as age, sex, level of education, income if possible. Sometimes there's other data that we collect to help us decide if we have a representative population, and those are things we want to collect that data if possible so we can assess that characteristic of our participants. How representative are they? We also need to think about, and this is just something that we need to be able to think about and describe, is who isn't included at each of these steps. So for our accessible population, are important people missing? And we need to disclose that when we describe our study methods. We also need to think very carefully about those sampling methods we want to use, and you read about those methods in your textbook. We talked about those various types of random sampling, one being stratified, one not. We talked about the non-random methods of collecting a sample. One being that idea of meeting a quota of certain people in certain groups. So you should think about those very carefully when you're selecting your methods to pick an appropriate sampling method to get a representative sample. And these sampling methods generate then your participants. So your participants are those people who are in your study, and your data pertains to those participants. And it's important to think about the degree to which those participants are representative of that accessible population. So one thing to consider when you consider the degree to which they're representative of that accessible population has to do with how many participated. You might invite 100 people to participate in your study, but if only 30% participate, that means you're missing 70% of your target population. Sometimes you can get response rates as low as 10%. So you have to look and pay attention to that also when you look at the articles you're reading, in terms of what is their target population. And then they usually won't tell you these details about the accessible population. That's often typically not described in a study. They will tell you how the sampling methods they use, so pay attention to that. Did they use random sampling or a convenience sample? What were those sampling methods? And then pay attention to how many people participated in that study, if it was a study in which people had a choice. And that will start giving you some insights into sampling, the different kinds of sampling methods, and you should start thinking about whether those were methods that you think would generate an unbiased sample, and a sample, the degree to which that would represent the target sample. I'd like to add a little postscript to what I said earlier when I was talking about our participants as wanting to be representative of this accessible population. And indeed, that's often what is most practical, but by definition, we want our participants to be representative of this target population.